through most of human history, there was very little change from generation to generation. In fact, environmental change was almost never measurable from generation to generation. Cultural and technological change wasn't either until we reached essentially the Industrial Revolution and access to fossil fuels. So we've created an unprecedented set of conditions. But humans don't just have to rely on genetic evolution. We have cultural evolution. The issue is that obviously evolution is based on survival of the fittest, but we are now a species facing a common threat, and it's kind of all or nothing. We can't have survival of the fittest human populations because we're essentially one population. So we really do have to use our capacity for rational thought, for envisioning the future, to come up with it's like a one-shot effort at cultural change, because if you don't get it right, there might be not enough people to survive for a global civilization. You do have to have a dream, and I don't think King told the story that this will be easy, this will be painless. He said he recognized that nonviolent pacifistic resistance was intensely painful and intensely costly, but it was worth it. And I really do believe that, and when I say that we could dramatically reduce our consumption by half without any pain, I think that's probably true, but half is not enough. We've got to get down to 95% less than we're consuming now. And some of that might be painful in profound ways. But if you talk to people who survived World War II, for example, in England or in the US, there was a lot of misery, a lot of suffering, but also a lot of intense, life was meaningful and important and worth living. And so, I do think that it's going to be very, very, very different. But I think that life right now, for a lot of people, doesn't have that kind of meaning. And I do think that rising together to meet a challenge gives you a profound sense of fulfillment, even if it's a difficult, painful challenge. You talk to people who've run a marathon, you talk to people who have done something difficult. It's not, they suffer and they're in pain, but it's worth it. And I just figure the alternative is so terrible. So it's not a question of continuing on as we are or hardship. Continuing on as we are is going to be far more hardship than an alternative. And we want to choose the best alternative. The problem is that we have so many people telling the story that there is no need for change, that we can continue on as we are, and technology will save the day, nature is more resilient than we thought. So there's one big challenge is what is the best way to convince people that we do need change? I actually think what I kind of expect is the idea of an optimal catastrophe. Well, if something bad happened, that's not so bad, that it's not too late. And so, for example, I wrote a little vision, my vision of the future when I'm a 92-year-old man dying that was published in Solutions. And in it, we're living in my own same tiny house with my son and daughter, and each of them have a partner and a kid, very crowded conditions, dramatically reduced consumption, raising our food in the backyard, but also intense community coming together, working together to solve the problems. And I actually think that one of the things about humans, I've traveled a lot, and I've gone to really remote areas in the Andes where I wanted to ask somebody if I could put my tent in a field. And the guy says, "No way you can put your tent in my field, not when I have a bed." And he brings me into his house and treats me extremely well. And he had, I took a picture of him to send him a picture. His wife, right in front of me, just changed into her other shirt. They had two shirts. By our standards, they were intensely poor. By their standards, they were very well-to-do, because in that community, they had all their teeth. They had beds, they had a roof. The guy had a gun so he could hunt. And, so what we consider rich, what we consider poor, is totally dependent on what others have around us. So if we see some people living very high on the hog and we're suffering, that's miserable. If we see everybody sharing our conditions, that's a different story. And I think that so much of our sense of well-being is relative to what others around us have. And if you look back in the past when most people's kids died and people were suffering and by our standards miserable, but you read the literature of the time, And read Chaucer, for example, and life expectancy was probably 40 years. Life sounded really good and fun. And if they had to compare themselves with us, they'd be miserable. If they're comparing themselves with each other, life is good and very worth living. I hope we could shift to a democracy away from where we are now, because I think anybody who believes that we live in a democracy, who believes that that my vote is equal to Bill Gates' vote or the Koch brothers, is delusional. I don't believe our elections are fair. I believe the one party always wins every election, and that's the money party. And so I don't believe we have a democracy. I do agree, though, that the closer you get to ecological limits, the less freedom there is for individual choice, and that we are pushing ourselves. So I think democracy is a luxury, and I would love to stay far enough from ecological limits to give us the hope of attaining a democracy. But again, I think countries like China, when they make the decision, can go in the right direction, but they often make the wrong decision. So I really hope we can stay far enough from ecological limits or respond quickly enough that we can aspire to democracy.